world stood still on Easter Monday, April 21, 2025, as the bells of Rome tolled not in celebration, but in mourning. Just hours after delivering his final blessing with a voice frail yet fierce, Pope Francis, the shepherd who refused to abandon his flock even in agony, took his last breath. His final words, whispered in the dark before dawn, carried profound meaning that would touch hearts worldwide. Despite doctors' urgent pleas, he chose to stand before thousands one last time, demonstrating his unwavering commitment to his pastoral duties. This untold story of his last hours reveals the depth of his dedication and the profound impact of his ministry, a narrative so moving that it resonates with the faithful and non-believers alike, capturing the essence of a pontiff who lived his beliefs until his final moment. The scene on Easter Sunday, April 20th, 2025, was both majestic and heart-wrenching as St. Peter's Square overflowed with 35,000 souls gathered to receive the Pope's blessing. The air hung heavy with the fragrance of spring tulips and the silent tears of those who sensed this might be a final farewell. Medical professionals had implored the Holy Father to rest, his lungs severely compromised by pneumonia and his heart showing signs of fatigue after years of tireless service. Yet Francis, ever the compassionate rebel who consistently prioritized pastoral presence over personal comfort, refused to let Easter pass without offering strength to the faithful. With visible effort, he clutched his chair for support as he struggled to raise his trembling hand in blessing, his voice barely audible as he proclaimed, "Christ is risen." What followed surprised even his closest aides. Rather than returning directly to his quarters, he insisted on descending into the crowd, allowing the Pope-mobile to move slowly through the assembly of weeping faithful. A particularly poignant moment occurred when a young girl reached out from the crowd, and Francis, with tender affection, touched her cheek in a gesture that one accompanying priest later described as his conscious goodbye to the younger generation he had always championed. The Pope's determination to connect with the people extended beyond the Easter celebration, as just days earlier, he had performed one of the most humble acts of his papacy by washing and kissing the feet of prisoners during the Holy Thursday liturgy. This traditional ceremony, symbolizing Christ's service to his disciples, took on heightened significance as Francis, clearly struggling with his health, knelt before 12 inmates from Rome's Rebibbia prison. Witnesses reported that he lingered longer than usual with each prisoner, exchanging quiet words that brought tears to hardened faces. One prison guard later revealed that Francis had whispered individual blessings to each inmate, promising them that God's mercy was infinite and that transformation was always possible. This act of humility and compassion, performed when his body was already failing, embodied the central message of his pontificate, that mercy must be extended to those on the margins, that no one is beyond redemption, and that true leadership manifests in service rather than authority. After the exhausting events of Easter Sunday, the Pope returned to his modest apartment at Casa Santa Marta, the Vatican guest house where he had chosen to live instead of the grand apostolic palace, a decision that had symbolized his rejection of pomp and his desire to maintain a simpler lifestyle. There, he collapsed into his bed, his breathing labored, and his strength nearly spent. According to the few attendants permitted to assist him, he insisted on finishing his evening prayers, despite his obvious discomfort. At approximately 6 a.m. the following morning, he woke gasping for breath as a stroke ravaged his brain, silencing the voice that had spoken so eloquently for peace and justice throughout his pontificate. By 7:35 a.m., his heart, which had carried the burdens of the Church and the world, finally failed. There was no fanfare surrounding his passing, no final public speech to be recorded for posterity, only a whispered prayer that his aides strained to hear. Miserando atque elegendo, by having mercy and by choosing. The personal motto he had adopted upon becoming Pope, and the principle that had guided both his life and his approach to leadership within the Church. The significance of Francis's final whispered motto reveals the depth of his spiritual understanding and his profound humility. These Latin words, taken from a homily by the Venerable Bede on the calling of Matthew the tax collector, had resonated with Jorge Bergoglio since his youth. They encapsulated his belief that God's gaze of mercy precedes and enables all human response, that divine choice elevates the unworthy, and that leadership in the Church must always flow from this fundamental recognition of unmerited grace. By returning to these words with his dying breath, Francis completed the circle of his vocation, affirming that the mercy he had received was the same mercy he had spent his papacy extending to others. On his desk, Vatican officials discovered an unfinished letter addressed to the orphans of Gaza, a testimony to his constant concern for children caught in conflicts not of their making, and a final indication that his thoughts remained with the suffering, even as his own life ebbed away. The journey that led Jorge Mario Bergoglio to become Pope Francis, and ultimately to his deathbed in the Vatican, began in Buenos Aires, Argentina, in 1936, where he was born to Italian immigrant parents who had fled fascist Italy. The future Pope's early life was marked by simplicity and hard work, including cleaning floors to help pay for his education. A critical moment in his youth occurred when, at age 21, he suffered a severe lung infection that necessitated surgery and nearly claimed his life. Years later, as Pope, he would often reflect on this experience, saying, "That was when I learned that suffering can be transformed into love." This early brush with mortality perhaps explained his lifelong empathy for the sick and his patience with his own physical limitations in his final years. His path to the papacy was unconventional, serving as a Jesuit provincial during Argentina's Dirty War, later becoming Archbishop of Buenos Aires, where he was known for his work in the slums, and finally emerging as a surprise choice in the 2013 conclave, following Benedict XV's resignation. As Supreme Pontiff, Francis consistently demonstrated that his understanding of papal authority differed dramatically from many of his predecessors. He kissed the feet of political leaders from South Sudan during peace negotiations, personally called victims of abuse to offer apologies, scolded powerful economic leaders at global forums, and systematically worked to reform the Vatican's finances and governance. Perhaps most symbolically, he upended Vatican traditions by choosing to live in a guest house rather than the papal apartments, washing the feet of women and non-Christians during Holy Thursday services, and maintaining his habit of carrying his own luggage when traveling. His final Urbi et Orbi message before his death became his last public testament, a passionate plea for peace in conflict zones, including Gaza, Ukraine, and numerous forgotten war zones across Africa and Asia. With unexpected energy that belied his failing health, he had cried out, "Stop selling weapons! Stop the economics of death!" before his voice faltered and he needed assistance to complete the blessing. Many in the square that day reported sensing that they were witnessing not just a papal address, but a prophet's final warning. In the aftermath of Francis's passing, Vatican officials were moved to discover 3 simple items in the pocket of his cassock: a well-worn rosary gifted to him by a favela resident during World Youth Day in Rio, a handwritten note with the phone number of a homeless man he had befriended during his walks in Rome, and a brief instruction regarding his funeral arrangements that read simply, "Bury me simply, no gold, just pray." These humble possessions spoke volumes about the priorities that had guided his papacy: prayer, personal connection with the marginalized, and a rejection of ostentation even in death. His funeral, scheduled for April 26th, would honor these wishes, breaking with the tradition of entombing popes in the crypts beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Instead, following his explicit instructions, Francis would be laid to rest in a modest tomb at the Basilica of St. Mary Major, a church he had frequently visited in private, often slipping out of the Vatican in the early morning hours to pray before the ancient icon of Mary known as Salus Populi Romani, protectress of the Roman people. His choice of final resting place revealed much about the man behind the papal title. St. Mary Major held special significance for Francis, as it was there, in the quiet hours of March 14, 2013, the morning after his election as Pope, that he had gone to pray alone, slipping past security to place flowers before the Marian icon and entrust his pontificate to her care. By choosing this location for his burial, he created a lasting connection between his first act as Pope and his final rest, demonstrating the consistency of his devotion and his desire to be remembered not primarily as a global leader, but as a faithful servant. Vatican insiders noted that he had specifically requested a simple stone marker rather than an elaborate monument with only his name, the dates of his papacy, and his motto. No honorifics, no lengthy epitaphs. This simplicity in death mirrored the simplicity he had championed in life, a final lesson to the Church about the genuine nature of Christian leadership. The accounts of Francis's final 48 hours reveal moments of profound spiritual significance that have already begun to shape his legacy. Despite his rapidly deteriorating condition, he insisted on speaking via video call to a parish community, sheltering in a church basement in Gaza, where ongoing conflict had created desperate conditions. Those present during this call reported that the Pope, struggling to speak clearly due to his illness, nonetheless managed to offer words of encouragement, telling the frightened parishioners, "Don't lose hope. The God who suffers with you will not abandon you." Following this emotional exchange, he was seen scribbling a name, Fatima, on his wrist, an action that has prompted much speculation. Some close to him suggested it referenced Our Lady of Fatima, whose message of peace he had frequently invoked during times of international tension, while others wondered if it might be the name of a refugee child whose story had particularly moved him, or perhaps a reference to his own mother's devotion to the Portuguese apparition. As dawn broke on Easter Monday, a Vatican janitor completing his early morning duties reported hearing what sounded like singing coming from the Pope's quarters. Upon investigation, no visitors were found, yet the distinct sound of a child's voice saying "Grazie" lingered in the air. This account, while impossible to verify, has already begun to take on the quality of sacred legend among the faithful, who see in it a sign of divine presence at the moment of Francis's passing. Whether understood as miraculous or merely symbolic, such accounts reflect the profound spiritual impact Francis had on those around him, and the sense many had that his connection to the divine was unusually direct and authentic. In the hours following the announcement of his death, spontaneous gatherings formed in St. Peter's Square, with people of diverse faiths and backgrounds sharing stories of how this pope had touched their lives, challenged their assumptions, or rekindled their faith in the possibility of a more merciful world. The theological significance of Francis's Easter death has not been lost on Vatican commentators, who note the powerful symbolism of a pontiff passing from this life during the season that celebrates Christ's victory over death. Throughout his papacy, Francis had consistently emphasized the Christian belief in resurrection, not merely as a future hope, but as a present reality that should transform how believers engage with suffering and injustice in the contemporary world. His final Easter message, delivered with such difficulty the day before his death, had emphasized this very point, that the risen Christ empowers the faithful to confront the forces of death, operating in social systems, economic structures, and political conflicts. By dying during the Easter octave, Francis provided a final, embodied illustration of his central theological conviction, that death, while real and often painful, does not have the final word in the Christian narrative. This temporal coincidence has already inspired numerous reflections connecting the Pope's physical passing with the spiritual transformation he consistently advocated. Francis's papacy was marked by numerous historic journeys that expanded the global footprint of papal diplomacy, including groundbreaking visits to Iraq, the Arabian Peninsula, and numerous marginalized communities that had never before received a papal visit. During these travels, he consistently prioritized encounters with the poor, refugees, indigenous peoples, and religious minorities, often adjusting official itineraries to create time for such meetings. Perhaps the most emblematic moment occurred during his 2019 visit to South Sudan, when he spontaneously knelt to kiss the feet of warring political leaders, begging them to maintain their fragile peace agreement. This gesture, captured in photographs that circulated worldwide, revealed a pontiff willing to humble himself completely in service of reconciliation. His final international journey, just 2 months before his death, had taken him to Southeast Asia, where despite already showing signs of the illness that would claim his life, He insisted on visiting refugee camps along the Thailand-Myanmar border, embracing Rohingya children, and condemning the globalization of indifference that allows such suffering to continue. Vatican sources have revealed that in the weeks before his death, Francis had been working intensively on several documents that he seemed determined to complete, sensing perhaps that his time was limited. These included an apostolic exhortation on the environmental crisis that was to serve as a follow-up to his landmark encyclical Laudato Si', extending its analysis to address the accelerating climate emergency and the ethical dimensions of new technologies being proposed as solutions. He had also been preparing materials for the upcoming Ordinary Synod, where he hoped to continue the Church's deliberations on synodality and inclusion. Most poignantly, he had nearly completed a personal spiritual testament, reflecting on his life journey and offering guidance to future church leaders about maintaining fidelity to the gospel in an increasingly complex world. Vatican officials have indicated that these final writings will be published posthumously, providing the faithful with what amounts to a spiritual last will and testament from a pope who consistently challenged them to greater authenticity, deeper mercy, and more courageous witness. The global reaction to Francis's passing has transcended religious and ideological boundaries, with tributes pouring in from world leaders, religious figures, and ordinary citizens touched by his ministry. Jewish and Muslim leaders have praised his consistent efforts to build bridges between faiths, with Jerusalem's Grand Mufti noting, "He showed us that religion should unite, not divide." Political figures from across the spectrum have acknowledged his moral authority. Even when they disagreed with specific positions, he took on issues ranging from climate change to migration to economic justice. Perhaps most telling have been the spontaneous memorials that have appeared in unlikely locations. In the slums of Buenos Aires, where he once ministered, in refugee camps across Europe and the Middle East, in prisons where his annual Holy Thursday visits were eagerly anticipated, and in indigenous communities whose rights he had championed. These grassroots expressions of grief and gratitude suggest that Francis's legacy will be measured not by institutional reforms or theological pronouncements, but by his success in embodying a more accessible, compassionate face of the Catholic Church to those who had felt excluded or marginalized. As the College of Cardinals prepares to gather for the conclave that will elect Francis's successor, Vatican observers note the profound transformation the Argentine Pope has effected in the composition of this body. Through his consistent appointments of cardinals from the peripheries, countries and regions historically underrepresented in church leadership, Francis has ensured that the electors now more accurately reflect the global distribution of Catholicism, with significant representation from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. His final consistory, held just months before his death, had continued this pattern, elevating prelates from nations that had never before had a cardinal. This demographic shift, perhaps more than any specific policy or pronouncement, may prove to be Francis's most enduring legacy, fundamentally altering the perspectives and priorities that will shape the Church's future direction. While speculation about potential successors began almost immediately following the announcement of his death, most commentators agree that the transformation Francis has initiated in the Church's orientation toward the marginalized, its engagement with contemporary social challenges, and its internal governance is likely to continue, regardless of who next occupies the chair of St. Peter. The final days of Pope Francis's life were marked by a characteristic determination to fulfill what he understood as his pastoral duties, regardless of personal cost. Vatican insiders have revealed that when doctors insisted he cancel his Easter appearances due to his deteriorating health, he responded with gentle but firm resolve, saying, "Christ did not come down from his cross. How can I abandon mine?" This comparison, while dramatic, reflected Francis's profound identification with the suffering Christ and his understanding of the papacy as fundamentally a ministry of presence to those in need. Throughout his final week, despite increasing difficulty breathing and episodes of confusion likely related to the stroke that would ultimately claim his life, he continued to receive visitors, sign important documents, and dictate messages to communities experiencing persecution or natural disasters. This stubborn insistence on continuing his ministry until the very end aligned perfectly with the message he had consistently preached, that authentic Christian leadership is measured not by power or privilege, but by willingness to serve even when service comes at great personal cost. The physical relic that many visitors to the Vatican have requested to see following Francis's death is remarkably humble. The worn, simple wristwatch he consistently wore throughout his papacy. Unlike the valuable timepieces often gifted to world leaders, Francis maintained his preference for an inexpensive watch he had purchased years before becoming pope, frequently visible in official photographs and during public appearances. This small detail, easily overlooked amid the grandeur of Vatican ceremonies, spoke volumes about his personal values and his conscious rejection of the material trappings that often accompany high ecclesiastical office. Similarly telling was his continued use of black orthopedic shoes rather than the traditional red papal footwear, a practical choice that became symbolic of his preference for substance over style, function over formality. These seemingly minor choices accumulated over the years of his papacy to create a powerful visual testimony to his conviction that the Church must return to evangelical simplicity if it is to effectively proclaim Christ's message in the contemporary world. Perhaps the most moving accounts from Francis's final days come from the small circle of religious sisters who assisted with his medical care at Casa Santa Marta. One sister, speaking anonymously to respect the Pope's privacy, revealed that even as his condition worsened, he insisted on personally signing cards and small notes to children who had written to him from around the world. His hand would shake terribly, she recounted, but he would say, "Each child deserves a real signature, not a stamp." This attention to personal connection, maintained until physical capacity failed completely, characterized a pontificate during which Francis had consistently prioritized direct engagement over protocol and bureaucracy. The same sister reported that in lucid moments between periods of medical sedation, the Pope would ask about specific individuals he had encountered during his ministry: a homeless man who often slept near the Vatican, a prisoner whose case for clemency he had been advocating, a family of refugees he had helped relocate. These inquiries revealed the deeply personal nature of his understanding of papal ministry and his refusal to allow institutional responsibilities to overshadow individual human connections. Francis's papacy coincided with a period of unprecedented challenges for the Catholic Church, including the continuing fallout from sexual abuse scandals, declining religious participation in traditional strongholds, internal tensions over doctrinal and pastoral priorities, and external pressures from shifting cultural and political landscapes. His approach to these challenges was consistently marked by a willingness to acknowledge institutional failures, a commitment to meaningful reform, and an insistence that the Church must engage constructively with contemporary realities rather than retreating into defensive postures. This openness to change, while unsettling to some traditionalists within the Church, earned him remarkable credibility with many who had grown disillusioned with ecclesiastical institutions. His final major address, delivered to the Roman Curia just weeks before his death, had returned to this theme, urging church leaders to cultivate holy restlessness rather than complacency and to remain constantly open to the guidance of the Holy Spirit, even when, perhaps especially when, that guidance leads in unexpected directions. This exhortation, delivered with the moral authority of a man clearly approaching his own mortality, seemed designed to ensure that the momentum for renewal he had initiated would continue beyond his papacy. The legacy of Pope Francis will undoubtedly be debated and assessed for generations to come, with perspectives varying widely depending on theological and ideological starting points. What cannot be disputed, however, is the extraordinary global impact of a papacy that consistently directed attention away from ecclesiastical concerns toward the needs of the poor, the Earth's environmental crisis, the plight of migrants and refugees, and the imperative of peace in a world torn by conflict. Through both symbolic gestures and substantive initiatives, Francis attempted to reorient the Catholic Church toward its evangelical foundations, emphasizing mercy over judgment, inclusion over exclusion, dialogue over denunciation, and service over status. The simplicity of his final days and the humble circumstances of his death served as a fitting conclusion to a life in ministry characterized by the conviction that authentic Christianity is measured not by doctrinal precision or ritual correctness, but by the concrete expression of compassion toward those most vulnerable and marginalized. As bells toll throughout the Catholic world and flags fly at half-mast in recognition of his passing, perhaps the most meaningful tributes are the countless small acts of mercy being performed in his memory: feeding the hungry, visiting the imprisoned, welcoming the stranger, embodying the vision of faith he so passionately proclaimed,